And I'd like to welcome everyone. My name's Rebecca Lowe. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator with the Lewis Public Library, and welcome to our series, Science and Society, Making Sense of the World Around Us. This lecture series is co-organized and moderated by Fred Dilla, Executive Director Emeritus of the American Institute of Physics and author of Scientific Journeys, Linda Dilla, former Public Information Officer at the Jefferson Laboratory and the U.S. Department of Energy, and Colin Norman, the former news editor at Science. So with that, I am going to turn the floor over to Linda. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We have a record audience for this, and I totally understand why. We've all walked the beach in Delaware and seen all those horseshoe crabs, and I'm very much looking forward to Professor Mark Botton giving us a little more information than that. He ended his career at Fordham, has spent quite a bit of time on the Delaware Bay and at the Udell Center here in Lewis, and I think he must have been born wanting to study horseshoe crabs, because just about everything he's written has been about that particular population of animals. And I invite him now to give us a good overview about horseshoe crabs. If you have a question, don't forget to put it in the chat, and we will do our best to get all of them in that we can. Welcome, Professor.
Okay, let's get the show on the road. Where's my slideshow thing? I can't find it. Are you seeing my screen, guys?
We can see your screen. If you can go all the way up to the top to where it says slideshow right there in the middle and click on that. Keep going over to the right. Keep going. Nope, further up. Look for the tabs across the top.
Yeah, I got the Zoom tab is
Oh, see if
going.
you, yeah,
There
see if
we
you could.
go. All
Okay,
right, now.
perfect. Yep. Click on that and then do currents from the beginning.
Yeah,
Perfect.
okay. Thank you all for inviting me to talk with you this afternoon about some of the work I've done with horseshoe crabs. A lot of it's in Delaware Bay, but I'll also bring in some of the work we've been doing internationally. So, basically, I'm going to focus first on just some general ecological, biological principles about horseshoe crabs, talk about some of the uses and importance of horseshoe crabs, the current and future threats to their populations, and some international conservation issues that I'm currently involved with. So we call them horseshoe crabs, but we call lots of other things crabs, including these guys. But in actuality, the species of what we call American horseshoe crab is more closely related to things like scorpions, spiders, ticks, and sea spiders. Anatomically, they're much closer to this group than they are to the true crabs. Horseshoe crabs are one of the few marine animals that spawn on sandy beaches, and again, those of you from the region have no doubt had the opportunity to witness the seasonal spawning activity of horseshoe crabs on the shores of Delaware Bay, which is arguably the single best place in the world to see large populations of horseshoe crabs. In mating, the male, which is the upper animal in the picture here, uses these two specialized legs called claspers to hold on to the back of the female. The female's the larger, lower animal in the illustration. And these hooks are used to hold tightly onto the females as the couples come ashore to lay the eggs. And this is what the eggs look like. They're laid in clusters of several thousand eggs that the females push down and bury into the sand up to about a foot or more in depth. And they're wonderful embryos to study. After about 3 weeks, they are these beautiful embryos that you can see here, sort of a miniature animal rotating around in its embryonic membrane. And shortly thereafter, they hatch out as these so-called trilobite larvae, which swim around for a short period of time before taking up residence on the seafloor. Like all arthropods, horseshoe crabs go through a series of molts where they shed the old exoskeleton that you see on the top and emerge with a new and larger uh, 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 cast. And then they go through this several more times in the first year, and it takes them about 10 years to reach sexual maturity. Why should we care about horseshoe crabs? Well, there are several factors that make them intriguing. One is that they're so-called living fossils. This is a specimen collected in Poland by paleontologist colleague Błażej Bosowski. And you can see quite clearly the basic body plan of the horseshoe crab was very well formed, as this specimen dates to about 150 million years next to the contemporary species. But if we go back even further to as much as 450 million years, this is one of the earliest specimens of horseshoe crabs collected in Manitoba by David Rudkin. And again, it's not an exact same species, but the basic body plan has been around since precedes the dinosaurs. Some other interesting things that you may know about horseshoe crabs is that they have excellent eyesight. Even though the design of their eye is very different than a mammalian eye, they nonetheless see quite well, and in fact can see almost as well at night as they can during the day, and they use their eyes for males to locate females. And Professor Hartline, shown here, won a Nobel Prize for his work on horseshoe crab vision. Horseshoe crabs consume a lot of different organisms. They eat a lot of clams, worms, and other invertebrates, but particularly in some parts of Southeast Asia, horseshoe crabs are also eaten as food for people. There are a number of threats to horseshoe crabs that I'll go through in a little bit of detail in the next few slides. We have several commercial uses for horseshoe crabs, primarily for biomedical purposes and bait in the U.S., habitat loss and degradation, and bycatch and ghost nets are recognized as yet another threat to their populations. So in terms of the biomedical industry, horseshoe crab blood is an important product. And here you see a facility where horseshoe crab blood is being extracted. And the reason it's important is the property that was first discovered in the 1960s by Fred Bang and Jack Levin, who discovered that the clotting or coagulation of horseshoe crab blood in the presence of bacteria was caused when the blood cells or amoebocytes release certain chemicals. This then, sort of a happenstance observation, led in the 1970s to the development of what's called the LAL test, or limulus amoebocyte lysate test. And this is used to test materials for the presence of bacterial contamination. And blood is extracted from the animals, and then the LAL product is purified and then used for the detection of bacterial contamination. So if a sample mixes with LAL and stays liquid, then they know that the sample is free of bacterial contamination. Whereas even if there's a trace amount of bacteria contamination, the solid or gelatinous clot will form, and that's an indication that the sample is contaminated in some form. Fortunately for the crabs, when they extract the blood, the crabs are returned to the water as mandated by the US FDA, and about 85% or more of the horseshoe crabs that are bled will survive the process. The health of everybody watching here is in one way or another dependent on horseshoe crab blood via the LAL test, because any of our medications, anybody getting an IV or injectable material or an implantable medical device needs to be assured that there's no bacterial contamination being put into your body that could cause sepsis and potentially even death. So the LAL test is what is currently the standard for testing for bacterial endotoxins. Recently, the USP or US Pharmacopoeia has approved an alternative test, which is based on a cloning of a gene that is involved with the reaction that causes the clot. Dr. Jiglik Ding from National University of Singapore was the inventor of that test, and this is going to be phased in, and presumably once it is phased in, the number of horseshoe crabs taken for blood may be reduced. Another aspect to the commercial use of horseshoe crabs is one that goes back to the historical archives of Delaware and New Jersey. In the 1800s and early 1900s, there was an industry that took horseshoe crabs and dried them and used to grind them up for fertilizer. And I can only imagine how it smelled when they stacked thousands of these guys like this. In some cases, like this pound net you see in New Jersey, crabs were funneled into these devices and then collected by horse-drawn carriages. About 1.5 million animals were collected from Delaware Bay each year from the 1870s through about the 1920s, when cheaper chemical alternative fertilizers became widely available. And this gives you a sense of the scale of some of the fertilizer collections. This was the last known factory on the Delaware Bay shore. It was located in a town in Cape May County, which a lot of the local residents still refer to by its old name of King Crab Landing. Today, horseshoe crabs are used commercially as bait primarily for eels and whelks. Bait fishery for these animals really took off in the 1990s, and many animals back then were simply hand collected directly off of spawning beaches in both New Jersey and Delaware. And prior to 1998, there was very little in the way of regulatory activity. It was very inconsistent across states, and there was no consistent monitoring of the numbers of animals that were caught for the bait fishery. And this brought about quite a few heated discussions about how best to try to manage that resource. And after a number of years, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission or ASMFC, determined that they really needed to have a coast-wide management plan. ASMFC manages a lot of interstate fisheries, striped bass, uh, bluefish, menhaden, and so on and so forth. They developed a plan for horseshoe crab management in the late 90s. And as part of that, landings of horseshoe crabs from the Delaware Bay region have annual caps, annual maximum allowable catches. And the current year, which just started, ASMFC decided that that quota would be 173,000 from Delaware, same number from New Jersey, and then somewhat less from Maryland and some from Virginia. And the harvest continues to be male only. Now, states can set stricter regulations than what AFMSC says. So, for example, New Jersey currently has a complete moratorium, but again, these can change from year to year. So one of the big questions in management is whether these regulations have brought the harvest down to a more sustainable level. So if you look on the left side bars, these are the bait harvests from 98, 99, 2000, et cetera. And what you can see is that the estimated catch was over 2 million per year, very large number. And that, if you follow the blue bars going across, that's now down in the range of, somewhere around 500,000 or so the last few years. The biomedical catch is shown in the yellow, but most of the ones that are caught for the biomedical collection are returned and survive. So this green bar is the estimated biomedical mortality, which uses a figure of 15% mortality of those which are collected. So if you look at the green bar, that's a fairly small fraction of the number that are collected for bait. But the take-home message is that since the enactment of the ASMFC regulations, the bait harvest has been reduced at least fourfold from what it had been. Now, are these regulations resulting in a larger population? Well, these are 5 regions as defined basically on the basis of genetics. And the key thing here is that there are a variety of different surveys that are used to estimate the health of the population, the size of the population, and the Delaware Bay population is assessed as being in, reasonably good shape. The standout here is that the New York region is not doing nearly as well as the ones in Delaware Bay and the South. So there's certainly room for improvement in terms of particularly the New York region and how it's doing. But the Delaware Bay region, in response to the fishery management, seems to be on the road to recovery. Whoops, sorry. And one other factor that came into existence with the ASMFC management process was the formation or designation of a no-take or sanctuary area where horseshoe crabs cannot be collected. And this is off the coast of New Jersey from roughly Ocean City, New Jersey, to a little north of Ocean City, Maryland. And it's named in honor of Carl Schuster, who was one of my early mentors when I first got started back in the late 70s. Another reason horseshoe crabs are important is the relationship to migratory shorebirds. The Delaware Bay is a key link in the migration path as these shorebirds overwinter in South America, stop over at various locations, including the Delaware Bay, and then go up to Hudson Bay for nesting. So this is a very lengthy and energy demanding flight, and the Delaware Bay provides this rich resource in terms of horseshoe crab eggs that we mentioned before. And here are some of the shorebirds that are commonly seen really from about the first week of May to uh, early June is when the shorebird migration peaks. And this in itself is a source of income for a number of organizations that run ecotourism related activities. Now, one of the points I want to get to is this other threat to crab populations, which is um, sea level rise and coastal erosion. And even if you zeroed out the uh, the harvesting of horseshoe crabs for the different purposes of bait and blood, we'd still have the problem of habitat degradation and habitat loss. We can measure sea level rise, and U.S. government does this through a series of long-term sea level, water level monitoring stations. And it so happens that uh, these are up and down the coast, and virtually see all these up arrows showing that the trend is for relative sea level rise to be increasing at virtually all locations along the coast. And in particular, Lewis, Delaware is the site of one of these monitoring stations. And this is the trend in sea level rise. And what I've circled here is the average rate, 3.77 millimeters per year. Doesn't sound like a lot. 3.77 millimeters is not, doesn't impress you as being a gigantic number. But one of the things to bear in mind is that the vertical rise in sea level shown here is a relatively small fraction of the shoreline retreat that would be expected. So for typical beach slopes in this area, the amount of shoreline retreat is estimated to be 50 to 100 times greater than the vertical sea level rise. So in other words, it doesn't take a big amount of sea level rise to cause extensive erosion. And again, if you're along the coast, you're certainly familiar with how quickly some of these beaches can be eroding. Trying to make predictions is, of course, tricky because what one of the drivers for sea level rise is tied in with global climate change and CO2 levels, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. And so there are various scenarios of how much CO2 controls there might be, whether the curve goes up dramatically, whether it's not quite as much. So lots of different models which are based on different assumptions. But what you can see is that you're sort of talking about in the range of half a meter or more of sea level rise by 2100. And again, that's the sea level rise, factoring in the erosional effect that it's going to be quite significant, not simply the vertical, but also the movement of the shoreline as the waves crash upon it. We can see that attempts to stabilize beaches are sometimes lead to some fairly ugly looking scenes, but this is what was at one time horseshoe crab spawning habitat. And so not only are these aesthetically unappealing, but they take away what would have been a good beach for the crabs. This is a worldwide problem. This is a slide that one of my Japanese colleagues shared with me and showing some seawall construction in Japan. You see these sorts of structures in China, in Hong Kong, and Taiwan, all through areas of Southeast Asia as well. So what used to be spawning habitat is now completely unsuitable. So one of the things I want to share with you is that the problem of horseshoe crab habitat loss and exploitation of horseshoe crabs is not a uniquely American phenomenon. And we want to spend a little time talking about some international aspects to the research and work that I've done over the last couple of decades. So we do have one species in the Americas. Uh, that's Limulus polyphemus shown here with its range from Maine down to the Yucatan. And in Asia, there are 3 species with somewhat overlapping ranges from as far north and east as southern Japan down through Indonesia, Malaysia, and as far to the west as India. We have some places like Indonesia that have 3 species of horseshoe crabs living in the same general area. But again, a fairly broad geographic range in Asia and a set of problems that are not exactly the same as what we have in the US. They have an industry to extract blood, but they do it differently. Instead of releasing the crabs back to the water, they bleed them until the crabs are dead. And then sometimes they're sold to secondary markets for food, as you see this gentleman enjoying his meal. Coastal development is, again, a huge issue, not just in Delaware Bay and Jamaica Bay in New York, but in Asia. This is a beach, typical shoreline beach in Japan. And believe it or not, this little beach over here is a spawning habitat for horseshoe crabs. It's the only patch of sand along an area that's otherwise covered up by seawalls. The picture on the right shows extensive aquaculture ponds, which are found in many areas of Asia, areas that were formerly mangrove areas or beaches are often been converted into shrimp ponds and other features that, again, take away what would have been natural spawning habitat for horseshoe crabs. Another problem that's found in Asia quite a bit is discarded fishing gear, or what's referred to as ghost nets. And it almost looks like I've shown the same picture twice here, but these are from 2 very different areas where horseshoe crabs get tangled up in the nets and die, and sometimes resulting in fairly massive mortalities. So, given the concerns that we have about overexploitation of horseshoe crabs, about habitat loss, sea level rise, and so forth, we try to we need to sort of convene some type of group that will address some of these concerns and try to advocate for the horseshoe crabs. And one of the seminal events in horseshoe crab conservation was a meeting that was held in Hong Kong in 2011, where speakers reported declines in all 4 species throughout the ranges. And as a consensus, the group felt that we needed to organize and have a voice in the conservation community that was specialized or tailored to the needs of horseshoe crabs. And so we became part of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN, which has a number of sub parts. But one of the main things that the IUCN does is publish what's called the Red List. And basically that's an assessment of the extinction risk for individual species. And we were recognized, we formed our group in 2012 following that event in Hong Kong that I mentioned. And we're one of dozens of similar groups within the IUCN. So, there are groups for, marine mammals, or groups for various plants, large terrestrial organisms, and so forth. So we're one of those close to 200 specialist groups. And one of our tasks, or the tasks of these groups, is to evaluate the data about a species and determine its extinction risk, ranging from a species of least concern, which again would be something that's very common and not perceived as threatened, and then working your way up the ladder to vulnerable, and then endangered and critically endangered. And you don't want to be in these categories where the species is judged to be extinct in the wild or has disappeared altogether. So part of the work that we took on was trying to evaluate where are horseshoe crabs on this ladder from least concern to highly endangered. Now, American horseshoe crab, one we have here in Delaware, was most recently assessed in 2016 and is now listed as vulnerable. Previously had been least concern. The tri-spine horseshoe crab, which lives in places like Japan and China, was assessed in 2018 and is now listed as endangered. Prior to our work, it was listed as data deficient, which is sort of a no man's land for status. And two other species in Asia are still listed as data deficient, but we're working on those assessments right now. And both are still currently data deficient. And the reason I say it hampers conservation efforts is that if you're trying to advocate to your government that a species needs protection and it's only listed as data deficient, it's a hard sell, as opposed to having it listed as endangered, which might really fire up public interest in conservation. Red listing doesn't guarantee protection, but it at least gives a voice, a credible voice, to how dire the situation might be if you list something as endangered or critically endangered. So what's our specialist group currently doing? As I mentioned, we are reviewing the population status and threats and the trends for the 4 species of horseshoe crabs. We've done the work for the American horseshoe crab. We've done the work for the tri-spine horseshoe crab. We still are in progress with the other 2. Our group is also active in organizing scientific meetings and increasing public awareness about horseshoe crabs. And we're currently working on developing what's called the Conservation Action Plan for the Asian horseshoe crabs. Our most recent international meeting took place a couple months ago in Singapore, 5th International Horseshoe Crab Workshop, and that was a meeting that led to the current plan to work on this conservation action plan. And we've also been active in publicizing our research, both in scientific journals and books such as these, and hopefully by giving talks such as this, I'll get more people interested in horseshoe crab conservation. Public awareness is very important, as a lot of people throughout Asia and even in the US are not familiar with horseshoe crabs or think of them as being sort of, creepy and don't get excited to save them. But some of our members are active in horseshoe crab rescue and education. Here's a slide from Orissa State in India. A really interesting and exciting program is done in collaboration with Ocean Park Conservation Foundation and City University of Hong Kong. Basically, they give public school children juvenile horseshoe crabs to raise in aquaria in the lab, and then when they get to be a certain size, they have these release events where they all take the kids that they've raised and give them their freedom back on the mudflat. So that's a wonderful program for public education done in Hong Kong. We have a number of our advocates who have organized some of these ghost net rescues. You showed a slide a few minutes ago showing the entanglement of horseshoe crabs in these discarded fishing nets. So there are programs in Malaysia and India and Singapore, and I'm sure I'm leaving a few of them out, where people, community folks go out and free the crabs from these ghost nets. Closer to home, there's a lot of public interest in the Delaware Bay area to rescue stranded horseshoe crabs. This is Slaughter Beach in Delaware, which, for reasons I'm not totally sure of, has a huge number of strandings of horseshoe crabs every year during the spawning season. So there are a group in Delaware, the so-called Just Flip 'em program run by ERDG, which is a nonprofit based in the Dover area. And there's another group doing a similar thing called Return the Favor in New Jersey. So they walk on the beaches and overturn the stranded horseshoe crabs and give them a chance to live where these stranded crabs would most likely otherwise die. One of the things we do, my students and I and many volunteers do in Jamaica Bay in New York, is we tag horseshoe crabs. This is done in coordination with a number of other groups through the Fish and Wildlife Service. And these tags give us information on migrations between different locations, gives us information on where they go and whether there's intermingling of populations between, let's say, locations in New York and those in New Jersey, et cetera. So we're part of a large team of people that does this tagging. And again, it's a great way to get people involved. We have volunteers from New York City Bird Alliance, from Kingsborough Community College. Some of my students from Fordham have been involved with this. And we get all sorts of other volunteers involved. So it's a great way to just spend a few hours on the beach, learn about horseshoe crabs, and contribute to scientific efforts. So let me wrap this up with just a few last thoughts. all horseshoe crab populations facing threats from human exploitation, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation. The U.S. populations, other than the New York region, appear to be holding steady, which is a good sign. After all, the huge harvests of the late 1990s would have probably not been sustainable very long. Um, However, just we shouldn't, lose sight of the fact that we have to keep monitoring these populations because we don't want to be complacent about the current status of horseshoe crabs. And again, ASMFC uh, reviews the data annually, and if stricter regulations need be put in place, they would do so. And the conservation of the Asian horseshoe crab populations has taken some positive steps, but it's definitely still a work in progress. It's harder because we're not just dealing with an interstate situation. There's no single body, regulatory body that oversees all the Asian countries. So it is difficult when you have species that are living in multiple countries. So we have done some good work, I think, but we have a long way to go before the regulation in Asia is as complete as it is in the U.S. So with that, I'll finish up and be glad to take questions.
Thank you, Mark. That was so interesting. I have some questions, and I've got several from the audience that I find interesting. It's such an old species. They have eyes. Do they have any other senses when they go looking for girls and girls look for
Yeah,
boys?
I mean, there's many cues that horseshoe crabs have available at their disposal. And I think one thing that they also have in addition to sight is a chemical sense. They're able to pick up chemical cues to find food, for example. Um, its role in mating, the chemical cues in mating are maybe a little less clear. There's some researchers that have suggested that they have. The eyes, by the way, because they're sort of on top of their head and the mouth is underneath, the vision is not helping them find food. That's strictly uh, what's called chemoreception or detection of chemical odors from the clams or, piece of fish or whatever's out there.
So tell me about where do they fit in the food chain? Who is their predator? Describe the day in the life of a horseshoe crab. And it's unbelievable that it takes them 10 years to get to maturity to even start
Yeah.
reproducing. So destroying their habitat is critical to their the long-term survivability of these creatures,
Yeah.
it seems to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess let me take the first part first
Yeah.
about the predator prey relations or whatever. Um, Once when they're young, they're highly vulnerable. The eggs are consumed in massive numbers by shorebirds, by gulls, by fish. The bigger they are, the less likely they'll be predated upon. So those very small ones will get eaten by things like blue crabs, hermit crabs, fish. When they get to be full size, They're vulnerable when they get flipped over on the beach. There also are some reports, uh, pretty well established, that loggerhead sea turtles will eat them. And I've seen some great pictures from Florida of alligators eating large adults. They sort of flip them up in the air they don't want the tail end coming in first, so they sort of flip them so that they get the other parts. But we don't, as a threat to their population, I don't think there are enough of those things to be nearly as significant as the human effect in terms of what we do to them directly or indirectly.
So we are really helping when we're all down on the beach in early spring and summer, flipping these guys over, especially if they've dug themselves in at the front, even if they're facing the right way.
Yeah.
You'll never get out of there.
Yeah.
And lifting them up and getting them to the water is the right thing to do.
Yeah, as long as, I mean, if they bury right side up and they're in damp sediment, damp sand, I think they'll be fine.
Okay.
So as long as the next tide comes up that high on the beach.
Okay.
The thing is with the tidal cycle, if they come ashore on a very high tide and the next tide doesn't come up to that point, then they might dry out and not make it. But yes, I absolutely think that the horseshoe crab rescue people flipping the crabs over in New Jersey and Delaware probably, I wouldn't want to say it's not the only thing that is going to bring about the resurgence of the crabs, but it's a help. It's a big help. And besides, it's kind of gory to watch them get eaten by seagulls.
Seagulls. I know it is. So many species aren't able to survive as long as these creatures have. Why do you think the horseshoe crab specifically has been so successful millions of years?
I think one of the things that they figured out is they have a very versatile life history strategy. In other words, they're not they're not specialized on one particular type of food. They're not specialized that they have to live in exactly a certain salinity of water. They're very tolerant of different environmental conditions. So over the eons, as Earth has warmed or cooled, and there's been changes in the shoreline, and sea level goes up and down with ice ages and things like that, because they're not fixated on one habitat or one type of food, they can sort of, roll with the punches, so to speak. Um, if you're an animal that's highly specialized, you only eat this one type of food and that food source disappears, then
You're done.
you're not going to make it. So they can survive because I think they have survived because of the flexibility in the in the diet and in their tolerance for temperature and salinity and other factors.
Thank you. Here's the only funding question I'm going to ask you. We're all worried about NOAA, specifically with the weather forecasting, and it also, I know, funds a lot of ocean work. Does it fund most of the horseshoe crab work? And if so, are you worried about the budget cuts in NOAA and whatnot?
And NSF.
Yeah, and NSF.
I don't want to turn this into
It's not political, is it? So just answer the
I mean a lot there has been funding to a number of people doing horseshoe crab work through the Sea Grant program.
Okay.
which,
Okay.
as you know, as a coastal state, you have Delaware as a major player there.
Yep.
We some years ago we had some support, grant support from New Jersey Sea Grant, New York Sea Grant. So that's under NOAA. That's part of ultimately Department of Commerce. A lot of my colleagues are chatting, on Facebook and elsewhere, worried about, the current
Budget.
funding line. It's always been hard to get funding for horseshoe crab research. It's not as though the money was rolling in, in years past. It was always difficult to get funded, but I think it will be even more challenging in the current mood.
Mark, does the pharmaceutical industry put any funding into conservation efforts?
Indirectly, I would say.
So let's move on to, I think, another very interesting question. We've only talked about horseshoe crabs in the northern hemisphere, but do they also exist in the southern hemisphere?
Well, not in the western part.
Okay.
The furthest south they go in the western hemisphere is the Yucatan.
Okay.
In Southeast Asia, places like certain parts of Indonesia are south of the equator by a few degrees. So yes, they're in the southern hemisphere, but only on that side in the Pacific.
How long can they live out of water if they're turned upside down and don't get eaten by a seagull?
No, they can make it for a couple of days if it's like a damp, cool day. If it's a really hot day with a lot of wind, they'll dry out quickly. So as long as maybe 2 days under ideal conditions, but could be quite a bit less if it's hot and they dry out.
Here's another interesting question. Do they stay underwater until it's time to spawn? And then what is the change in the environment that triggers the spawning event?
Uh, the likely cue is the change in day length. In other words, during the winter, they're off in deeper water at Delaware Bay, or they're out off the mouth of Delaware Bay. And how do they know that spring is coming? Right? The water hasn't warmed up yet. So the only reasonable cue is the change in day length. So that's what I think is likely sort of getting the urge to come near shore.
Do they
But
have
somebody could prove me wrong on that, I'm sure.
do they have a depth of water that they like to stay in? The Delaware for a long way out isn't very deep,
Yeah,
right?
I did a study on this a long time ago. We were looking at the distribution of horseshoe crabs on the continental shelf, and they definitely prefer or they have a tendency to stay in relatively shallow water, like 30 meters or less. Occasionally, one will wander off. I think we've got a record of one that was like 400 meters, but he was probably lost. Uh, you know,
One in
but
every crowd.
generally closer to shore, within, let's say, 30 meters depth or less.
Mark, I'm still struck by two of your statements that this creature is at least 450 million years old, and it has these amazing eyes that generated a Nobel Prize. What else do we know about the vision? How acute is it? Does it sample colors?
Do males and females have the same number of eyes?
Yeah, males and females are the same in terms of numbers
And
of eyes. Um, I don't know that they see color. I don't ever remember reading about that. They can detect polarized light, and I think although they have other receptors, loosely called eyes, the two that I showed the close up of, the lateral eyes, are the ones that are
Right.
the image forming eyes. There are others that detect light and dark, but not images. So it's, in terms of what they're using and what the balance is among them, I'm not sure. That's not something that I know a lot about.
Do we know how acute the vision is in terms of spatial resolution? What can they tell apart in terms of
Um,
distance?
I'm a little rusty on some of those reports that were done some years ago, but they can definitely differentiate shape. They can differentiate um, females, or the males can detect the shape of females and are drawn to it if you put them in an aquarium or something like that. On the other hand, I've also seen the males try to mate with logs and and big rocks and things like that. So uh,
Not
I
a very big brain.
I guess eventually they realize that it's the wrong thing.
Is there anything else as citizens we can do other than flipping them over?
Yeah,
And
I think you know I mean in general, uh, looking at um, what people refer to as nature-based solutions for shoreline protection. In other words, instead of just reflexively saying, "Oh, we want to build a bulkhead or something like that," look for a more benign way of protecting the coast that will not permanently damage it. Because if you put these rocks and things on the beach, then that's forever. I mean, it really doesn't it becomes extremely costly to try to uh, remediate some of these places. So if you look, for example, at some of these efforts at so-called living shorelines, uh, build in concert with nature rather than in opposition to it. And I know it's difficult because if you're a coastal resident, you want to say, oh my gosh, I got to protect my house. I got to put up a structure. Um, but I think over time, we've got to move away from hardening or armoring the shoreline. And so as citizens, I think, we've got to advocate for a more of a try to have a natural approach to working with the shoreline. And in some areas, particularly in areas that are um, sparsely developed, it may be more efficient in the long run to offer buyouts to people to move away from the shoreline rather than try to armor it. I'm thinking of you may remember a couple of pictures I showed from the New Jersey side of those sort of those trailers with the rubble in front of it. You know, it would make more sense if there are similar situations to buy people out and say, okay, you move half a mile inland and we'll let the shoreline revert to a natural condition rather than try to, put up a hard structure that takes away the biological value of that habitat.
I'm going to ask you two last questions at one time, and then we'll unmute ourselves and say thank you. One of them is there a function to the tail, and can you talk about it? And what is their average longevity? I think you said earlier it was 20 years, and they stop molting at some point, correct? And just maintain a size, or are they always molting as they age?
I think once they get to adult size, they generally don't molt beyond that point. Occasionally they do, but for the most part, it's what we refer to as a terminal molt. So they reach the adult size, and we kind of infer this because of the size and number of some of the organisms that grow on the backs of the crabs that couldn't reach that size if the crab repeatedly molted.
That makes sense.
I think the other question was about the tail.
Yeah. What's
The
it do?
main function of the tail is to help flip the crab back right side up. Now, that works really well when they have the buoyancy in the water. So if you turn them over in the water, they're actually quite agile and can flip themselves over, and they sort of plant the tail in the ground and use that as kind of a pivot point. It doesn't work so well when they're on dry land because obviously they don't have the buoyancy of the water. So that's the main role of the tail. And then if you notice, sometimes you see horseshoe crabs where the tails are shorter or broken. And one of the things we want to be careful of when we're handling the crabs on the beach, if you're flipping them, is to try not to pick them up by the tail because that can break or become loosened, and then it isn't useful to the animal. So I know there's a temptation sometimes to pick them up by the tail, but it's better to flip them through the front end.
Right.
Yeah, they don't bite, everybody. They
They
don't.
don't bite. Totally
There's no
harmless.
teeth.
It's
Not like a
totally
snake.
harmless.
Yeah, you have given us so much information in just an hour, Mark. I really appreciate your time and the amount of work you've done for the topic and for these creatures that are so old. I invite everybody to unmute yourself if you want to. It's typical for us to clap and say thank you. So if anybody would like to join me and do that, we have an end to do that.
Thank you.
We
Thank you.
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you again.
Everybody for joining us.
Bye.
See you next
Bye.
month.
Thank you.